Okay, so the next topic is the characteristics of living things. Now, one good question whenever we are studying biology is, what is life? Okay, so we all have an intuitive sense of what life is. If we see a rabbit on a rock, we know that the rabbit is alive and the rock is not. But it is difficult to state just what makes the rabbit alive. Likewise, in the instant after an individual dies, we may wonder what invisible process or what invisible essence has transformed the living into the dead. Now, one way to define life is to list its basic components. The cell, as we all know now, is the basic unit of life, which means every organism or living individual consists of one or more cells. Every cell has an outer membrane that separates it from its surroundings. This membrane encloses the water and other chemicals that carry out the cell's functions. One of those biochemicals, the deoxyribonucleic acid or the DNA, is the informational molecule of life. Now, cells use genetic instructions as encoded in DNA to produce proteins, which enable cells to carry out their functions in tissues, organs, and organ systems. Okay, so a list of life's biochemicals, however, provides an unsatisfying definition of life. After all, placing DNA, water, proteins, and a membrane in a test tube does not create life. And a crushed insect still contains all of the biochemicals that it had immediately before it died. Okay, so in the absence of a concise definition, scientists have settled on five qualities that, in combination, constitute life. So these are that life is organized, life requires energy, life maintains internal constancy, life reproduces itself, grows and develops, and finally, life evolves. Note, however, that these traits may also occur in non-living objects. A rock crystal is highly organized, but it is not alive. A fork placed in a pot of boiling water absorbs heat energy and passes it to the hand that grabs it, but this does not make the fork alive. A fire can reproduce and grow, but it lacks most of the other characteristics of life. It is the combination of these five characteristics that makes life unique. So first of all, we have life is organized. Now, just as the city where you live belongs to a country, state, and nation, living matter also consists of parts organized in a hierarchy. At the smallest scale, all living structures are composed of particles called atoms, which bond together to form molecules, and these molecules can form organelles, which are compartments that carry out specialized function in cells. Many organisms consist of single cells. In multicellular organisms, however, the cells are organized into specialized tissues that make up an organ. Now, multiple organs are linked into an individual's organ system. Now, we have now reached the level of the organism, which may consist of just one cell or of many cells organized into tissues, organs, and organ systems. Organization in the living world extends beyond the level of the individual organism as well. A population includes members of the same species of an organism occupying the same place at the same time. A community includes the populations of different species in a region, and an ecosystem includes both the living and non-living components of an area. Finally, the biosphere refers to all parts of the planet that can support life. An organism, however, is more than a collection of successively smaller parts. An emergent property or emergent properties are new functions that arise from interactions among a system's components, much as, a flour, sugar, butter, and chocolate. When they come together, they form brownies. which is something not evident from the parts themselves. Another example of emergent properties, which are the thoughts and memories, are produced by interactions among the neurons in a person's brain. For an emergent property, remember the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Emergent properties explain why structural organization is closely tied to function, saying if you disrupt a structure, the function ceases. Brain damage, for example, disturbs the interaction between brain cells and can interfere with memory, coordination, and brain functions. Likewise, if a function is interrupted, the corresponding structure eventually breaks down, such as unused muscles beginning to waste away. Biological function, remember, and form are interdependent. Next, life requires energy. Now, inside each cell, countless chemical reactions sustain life. These reactions, collectively called metabolism, allow organisms to acquire and use energy and nutrients to build new structures, repair old ones, and also to reproduce. Biologists divide organisms into broad categories based on their source of energy and raw materials, as you can see in the picture. Producers are also called as autotrophs. They make their own food by extracting energy and nutrients from non-living sources. The most familiar producers are the plants and microbes that capture light energy from the sun, but some bacteria can derive chemical energy from rocks. Next, we have consumers. In contrast, they obtain energy and nutrients by eating other organisms, living or dead. Consumers are also called heterotrophs because hetero means other. You are a consumer using energy and atoms from food to build your body, move your muscles, send nerve signals, and maintain your temperature. The next category is decomposers. Now, these are heterotrophs that absorb energy and nutrients from waste or dead organisms. Fungi and bacteria are considered to be decomposers. Now, within an ecosystem, organisms are linked into elaborate food webs, beginning with producers and continuing through several levels of consumers, but energy transfers are never 100% efficient. Some energy is always lost in the form of heat. Because no organism can use it as an energy source, heat represents a permanent loss from the cycle of life. All ecosystems, therefore, depend on a continuous stream of energy from an outside source, which is usually the sun. Now, we also have to remember that life maintains internal constancy. The conditions inside cells must remain within a constant range even if the surrounding environment changes. For example, a cell must maintain a certain temperature. It will die if it becomes too hot or too cold. The cell must also take in nutrients, excrete waste, and regulate its many chemical reactions to prevent a shortage or surplus of essential substances. Homeostasis is the process by which a cell or organism maintains this state of internal constancy or equilibrium. The ability to sense and react to stimuli is a vital part of maintaining homeostasis. To illustrate this idea, look at the picture here. Consider mechanisms that help maintain your internal temperature at about 35 degrees Celsius. When you go outside on a cold day, you may begin to shiver. Heat from these muscle movements warms the body. That's why you shiver. In severe cold, your lips and fingertips may turn blue as your circulatory system sends blood away from your body's surface. Conversely, on a hot day, sweat evaporating from your skin helps you cool down. Next, life reproduces itself, grows, and develops. Organisms reproduce, making other individuals that are similar to themselves. Reproduction transmits DNA from generation to generation, and this genetic information defines the inherited characteristic of the offspring. Now, reproduction occurs in two basic ways. It can either be asexual or sexual. So in asexual reproduction, genetic information comes from only one parent, and all offspring, they are virtually identical. One-celled organisms, such as bacteria, reproduce asexually by doubling and then dividing the contents of the cell. Many multicellular organisms also reproduce asexually. Another example is a strawberry plant. For instance, they produce runners, as you can see in the picture, that sprout leaves and roots, forming new plants that are identical to the parent. Another example would be fungi. So fungi reproduce countless asexual spores, visible as the green, white, or black powder on moldy bread or cheese. Some animals, including sponges, reproduce asexually when a fragment of the parent animal detaches and develops into a new individual. And then next we have sexual reproduction. Now, in sexual reproduction, genetic material from two parent individuals unite to form an offspring which has a new combination of inherited traits. By mixing at each generation, sexual reproduction results in tremendous diversity in population. Now, why is genetic diversity important? It's because genetic diversity enhances the chance that some individuals will survive even if conditions change. Sexual reproduction is therefore a very successful strategy, especially in an environment where conditions change frequently. It is extremely common among plants and animals and fungi. Now, if each offspring is to reproduce, it must grow and develop to adulthood. Each young swan, for example, started as a single fertilized cell that divided again and again, developing into an embryo. Continued cell division and specialization yielded the newly hatched swans, which will eventually mature into adults that can also reproduce just like their parents. Next, we have evolution. So life indeed evolves. One of the most intriguing questions in biology is how organisms become so well suited to their environment. A beaver's enormous front teeth, which never stops growing, are ideal for gnawing food or wood. Tubular flowers have exactly the right shapes for the beaks of their hummingbird pollinators. Some organisms have color patterns that enable them to fade into the background. Now, these examples and the countless other examples that you can think of right now illustrates adaptation. Now, an adaptation is an inherited characteristic or behavior that enables an organism to survive and reproduce successfully in an environment. Now, where do these characteristic or where do these adaptive traits come from? The answer lies in natural selection. The simplest way to think of natural selection is to consider two facts. The first one is that populations produce many more offspring that will survive to reproduce. These organisms must compete for limited sources such as food and habitat. Now, say for instance, a single mature oak tree may produce thousands of acorns in one season, but only a few are likely to germinate, develop, and reproduce. The rest, they just die. Second, no organism is exactly the same as any other. Genetic mutations, or the changes in an organism's DNA sequence, they generate variability in all organisms, even those that reproduce asexually. Now, of all the offspring in a population, which ones will outcompete the others and survive long enough to reproduce? The answer is those with the best adaptation to the current environment. Conversely, the poorest competitors are most likely to die before reproducing. A good definition of natural selection, then, is the enhanced reproductive success of certain individuals from a population based on inherited characteristics. So we have to remember what Sir Charles Darwin said. It is not the strongest of the species that survives, not the most intelligent that survives. It is the one that is most adaptable to change. Okay, so as you can see here in the picture, this is how actually a bacteria produces antibiotic resistance. Now, the illustration shows a population of a bacteria in which a mutation has occurred in one cell. If antibiotics are present, the drug kills most of the unmutated cells. The mutated cell, however, is unaffected and can reproduce. After many generations of exposure to the drug, antibiotic resistant cells are common. That's why it is very important to take your antibiotics as prescribed by your doctor, because in the Philippines in particular, people tend to overuse or misuse antibiotics. Say, for instance, the antibiotic should be taken 3 times a day for 7 days. When you take your antibiotics, you would notice that usually on the 3rd or 4th day, all the symptoms of your infection is already gone. And people tend to go away with continuing with their antibiotics because they already feel better. And that's one way on how bacteria become resistant to that certain type of antibiotic. That's why if you read on journals or periodicals now, there will be a lot of discussions about how bacteria nowadays are almost all antibiotic or resistant to antibiotics. Now, the same principle applies to all populations. In general, individuals with the best combinations of genes survive and reproduce, while those with less suitable characteristics fail to do so. Now, over many generations, individuals with adaptive traits make up most or all of the population. Now, the environment is constantly changing, right? The continents, they shift, the sea levels rise and fall, climates become warm, sometimes cool. Now the question is, what happens to a population when the selective forces that drive natural selection change? Now, only some organisms survive, those with the best traits in the new environment. Okay, so features that may once have been rare become more common as the reproductive success of individuals with those traits improve. Notice, however, that this outcome depends on variability within the population. If no individual can reproduce in the new environment, the species, they go extinct. Now, natural selection is one of the mechanisms of evolution, which is a change in the genetic makeup of a population over multiple generations. Although evolution can also occur in other ways, natural selection is the mechanism that selects for adaptations. Charles Darwin became famous in the 1860s after he published a book on describing the theory of evolution by natural selection. And another naturalist, in the name of Alfred Russel Wallace, independently developed the same idea at around the same time. Now, evolution is the single most powerful idea in biology. Okay, so as what we have discussed in detail, the similarities among existing organisms strongly suggest that all species have evolved from a common ancestor, and that evolution has molded the life that has populated the planet since the first cells formed almost 4 billion years ago, and it continues to act today.